Record.
Welcome to this talk on lichen in the Johnson Creek Watershed. My name is Daniel Newberry. I'm the executive director, and I'll be leading you through some of the basics of the most common lichen that you can find in our watershed here in Northern Oregon. And although there are only 4 that we're going to be focusing on, I'm also going to go over a few others that you may find. And this is all in preparation for the lichen walks that we have coming up at Foster Floodplain. So let's get started and bring up our PowerPoint presentation, and we'll get started. Okay, so we're calling this Take the Lichen Challenge. And we're going to focus on these 4 lichen. How many of the most common of these lichen that are in the Johnson Creek watershed can you find within 4 blocks of your home? So we're going to get started, and I have a few vocabulary words that are related to the anatomy of lichen, and I'll be going through those. And remember them, because when we go to identify lichen in the field, it'll be very important to be very specific, very intentional about the language we use and the vocabulary in particular. But let's start off. What is a lichen? You know, it's not a plant. It's not a fungus, although fungus is a part of it. It's really a symbiosis. It's a mutually beneficial relationship of a fungus in symbiosis with bacteria or algae. And there are really 3 main types of lichen, and those are called crustose lichen, foliose lichen, and fruticose lichen. And the 3 pictures that we have at the bottom, the one on the bottom left is a crustose lichen, not the yellow, but the white. And crustose lichen is attached to its substrate like a crust and attached in many different attachment points. And you can remember that, crust and crustose. A foliose lichen, like the one in the center at the bottom, you'll probably recognize the word foliose. It means leaf-like, from foliar, which we're used to when talking about plants. And the foliose lichen are really more 2-dimensional. They're kind of like a leaf, and that's the way you remember it. The third one, which you'll see in the lower right, is called fruticose, and that's really more 3-dimensional. You know, you can think of it as being like a shrub or a tree. And in this case, the picture that you see, it has long filamentous like hairs, but in this case, blown up. You can see it has very thick, kind of cylindrical, round, hair-like structures with side structures. So crustose, foliose, and fruticose. And for this talk and the lichen challenge, we're going to limit this to foliose and fruticose lichens, and together they're known as macrolichens. The crustose lichens that we saw in the earlier slide, those are known as microlichens, and they're much, much harder to identify down to the species level without special chemical and ultraviolet light tests. That can be a lot of fun too, but I think it's really beyond the scope of beginning lichen ID. So let's start off, talk a little bit about lichen and their role in an ecosystem. So lichen, that one of the symbionts is a cyanobacteria. They will fix nitrogen, and therefore add to the soil, add nitrogen to the soil when they decompose, and nitrogen in general trap dust. And that's also a way to aid in soil formation, bringing more nutrients into the soil and bulk. You'll also find that lichens are a food source for many mammals, especially in cold climates, where during cold times of year, it's tough for some of the animals to find food. And lichen, being around all year, provides a really good food source. Lichen are also great nesting material for birds. And I just had to include this photo that you'll see at the bottom. It's a wonderful photo showing coevolution. The grasshopper that you see, which is really well camouflaged, has evolved to camouflage itself, perhaps for this particular species or particular genus of lichen. Well, what about people and their use of lichen? Well, two major things that people have used lichen for. One is food and one are dyes. So when it comes to food, I will say that the majority of lichen are edible. But please, I'm asking you not to just try eating a random lichen, because worldwide, there are a few lichen species that are tremendously poisonous, and you don't want to make a mistake. But in terms of our short talk today, we're going to not really get into the edibility of specific lichen species, but please don't eat a lichen unless you can ID a species and you know that that species is edible. Now, when it comes to dyes, lichen make a really good source for coloring natural fibers. And with a lot of synthetic colors, the fibers actually have to be prepared. The wool or the yarn or whatever has to be prepared in a special way to receive the color. That's not the case with lichen, which are a natural source of color. There are really two different ways that people traditionally have gotten the lichen color into the different fibers. One is a method that involves boiling water, and that usually results in lighter hues. There's another method where an ammonia solution is put in a bottle, and the fibers are put in with it. It's shaken from time to time and kept in there sometimes for days. And the longer you keep it in there, the darker the hue of the dye. A few fun things before we get started with looking at individual species. Some people will look at lichen on a dead tree and they'll think, boy, that lichen, it killed the tree. Not so. When you see lichen on dead trees, it's because they're the leaves and therefore the light can get in. And the lichen love light. They need light. Lichen are also sensitive to air pollution. And through the study that lichenologists have done over the decades, they've been able to determine which species of lichen are more sensitive to nitrogen and sulfur, mainly nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, which, as you know, are associated mainly with automobile exhaust and other emissions from different industrial sources. And so what you see and what we see, since we're right in the city, is that the lichen that we find most frequently are lichen that are very tolerant of high nitrogen and high sulfur. And when it comes to doing this type of work that some scientists have done, where they've taken samples all over the cities and wildland areas, rural areas, and looked at the distribution and been able to tell about a little bit about the air quality because of what they find, it's not necessarily the species that you find that tells you about the sensitivity. It's the species that you don't find. There's a really fun species that you see in old growth forests, especially nearby here on Mount Hood. Lungwort is the common name. Wonderful species, but it is very sensitive to sulfur and nitrogen. And as a result, you will not find it here in our watershed or anywhere in the city. You'll have to go out a little bit to where the air gets cleaner. Lichen reproduce both sexually and asexually, and we're going to be talking about that a little later. I'm going to introduce a few vocabulary words that'll help us talk about that. So let's start with number one. And this is by far the most common that you'll see, is oak moss. It's also known scientifically as Evernia prunastri. It is a foliose lichen, and you will notice, if you look at it, you see how it's the substrate, the substance of the lichen, the body of the lichen, which we call a thallus, Thallus. The thallus is really two-dimensional. It's sort of like somebody took a piece of paper and cut out a shape that looks, interestingly enough, like the horns of a deer. And of course, deer are a species, or the many different deer species, they eat a lot of lichen. But the reason this is called oak moss is that if you look, for instance, throughout the Willamette Valley and even into Southern Oregon during the dormant season, you will see these sea of white or greenish white all over Oregon oak trees. And this is the oak moss. But I do want to point out that oak moss grows on plenty of hardwood species, not just Oregon oak. And once again, the body of the lichen is called the thallus, Thallus. And in this case, the thallus of oak moss is foliose. And it's light green on one side and white on the other, which is something you find on many, many foliose lichens. And this is heavily branched. And what's really cool about this particular species, this oak moss, is that it branches every year. So this can help to tell the approximate age of the lichen. In this case, I'm starting at the top and I'm seeing one branch, two branchings, three branchings, four branchings that have happened. So we know it's at least 4 years old. And I say four, at least four, and not exactly four, because new lichen sometimes can take a while to grow and get established. But we know this is at least 4 years old. So this is our number one of the four most common lichen that you'll see. So let's look at number two. I think we've all, probably those of us who live in this area, have all gone hiking and seen cottonwood trees, forests that have a lot of cottonwood trees. And chances are, if you've looked at the cottonwood bark, you've seen this bright, bright color. Yellow color. Most likely that's Xanthoria parietina, also known as sunburst lichen, which you can see. That genus of Xanthoria is really the only yellow colored lichen genus you will see in our area. There are one or two other Xanthoria species that you might see, but the difference here is this is the one that is a foliose lichen. I think you can probably see my cursor here. I'm moving it around the center of the screen, and you can see this leaf-like protrusion coming from the sunburst lichen. Now, over on the left, you see these dark orange circles, much, much darker than the foliose thallus. And these are sticking out. These are known as apothecia, Apothecia, and these are parts of the lichen that are associated with sexual reproduction. So the habitat for sunburst lichen is hardwood trees and also shrubs. And I should point out that if there were to be any invasive lichen species, it would be this one. Although I've never read that this is really causing any harm anywhere. I think some scientists think of it a little bit as invasive because it's been spreading so rapidly. It's been noted in the last 50 years, it's really spread in the Willamette Valley, but it's also spread worldwide. And there are cases in other parts of the world where you'll really find sunburst lichen on rocks as well. There have been places in marine environments where it's been found. So it really is quite a generalist and can thrive in a lot of different habitats. The third, I was going to say species, but I'll say the third type of lichen that's the most common in our watershed is the lichen in the genus Usnea. And I say in the genus Usnea rather than looking at a specific species because this can be difficult to get down to the species level sometimes. And so I think it's better for what we're doing here to just be able to recognize what are called the beard lichens. You can see why they're called beards. They have these strands of hair. When you go to an old growth forest, like nearby in Mount Hood, sometimes you will see these long strands of Usnea with a long central cord that's sometimes 3 feet long or even longer. And chances are that's the one known as old man's beard, found once again in old growth forests in particular. Most of these, they have that central cord with the side branchings on it. They're pale greenish, sometimes yellowish tinged. They're attached at a single attachment point on wood, and they all often are dangling. So that's beard lichen. Scientific name of the genus is Usnea. So the fourth one we're going to look at is, it's known as shield lichen, and the scientific name is Parmelia sulcata. And as you can see here, this is also a foliose lichen. You can see once again it has that two-dimensional leaf-like look. I do want to point out, if you look right in the center of this, you'll see some little white bumps. Those are Soredia, and Soredia. Soredia are asexual reproductive features of a lichen. And when we get to the microscope portion, we're going to look at them in greater detail. The shield lichen, you'll find, like I mentioned with some of the other foliose lichen, they are different colored on both sides. In this case, their lower surface is black or brown. And you have these occasional little hairs on the bottom side called rhizines, R-H-I-Z-I-N-E-S, rhizines. And you'll also have pale angular markings along the lobe tips, which we will also see under the microscope. So those are the four. And let's just do a short little quiz together and look at some of these. And I do want to mention that sometimes you can even have all four of them growing together. So let's look at this. Do you think this is oak moss? Do you think it's sunburst lichen? Do you think it's beard lichen or shield lichen? What do you think? Well, this is shield lichen. And once again, you see these cracks. You see the foliose thallus. You see the, well, it's kind of hard to see you don't really see the Soredia here, but of the four we've been looking at, this is definitely a shield lichen. Well, what about this one? What do you think? Which one of these do you think this is? Remember, what we're seeing here is that light green and heavily branched structure that looks a little bit like a reindeer's antler. So yes, this is oak moss. And this particular one we're looking at now is the sort of the dangling hair-like small structure in the middle. There are many lichen in this photo, but we're looking at this light green hair-like and structure. And yes, that is the beard lichen. And the only one we haven't looked at on this slide is the sunburst lichen. And you will see that this is sunburst. You'll see that leafy yellowish, in some cases yellowish green. And then you will see the apothecia rising from the surface, those cylindrical cups that are a little bit darker in color. So we've looked at the top four, but I do want to go over several more, which you may find for those of you who are interested in maybe knowing a few more species. So let's quickly go through some of these. The next one is Platysmatia glauca. You find these more in closed forests rather than out in the open. To me, they look like big sheets of paper that have been cut and kind of curled. You'll see in this photo, I also included a small picture of the reverse. This very much like the Parmelia sulcata that we saw earlier. This has the lighter color and the very dark brown black on the back surface. And this particular lichen, a single phallus, single organism, can be pretty big, up to 15 centimeters. You can find big samples of the Platysmatia glauca. Now, I know I said we weren't going to look at crustose lichens, but this is one that, at least to the genus level, you can find an ID very easily. And part of it has to do with the habitat. So this is dust lichen, Lopraria is the name of the genus. It's crustose. It has a powdery look. It's light green. But I like to talk about this one and offer it to you because it has a very specific habitat preference. And you'll find it growing on conifers, Douglas fir and western red cedar in our watershed. And you'll find it in mature canopy or closed canopy, where the conifers are big enough that their barks have started to develop that furrowed look to it. And a good place in the Johnson Creek watershed to find this is in Powell Butte, on some of the trails, like either the Dogwood Trail or the Cedar Trail, but anywhere really that you find those closed canopy forests that have conifers in them. So if this photo looks familiar, this was one of the ones I showed earlier, a little piece of it. You see that Usnea in the upper right-hand corner, and you see little bits of sunburst lichen breaking in. You'll see the oak moss coming out at you, and down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the Parmelia sulcata, the shield lichen. So that's all four of the top ones that we looked at, but you'll notice another brown lichen here. And this is you see it's a foliose lichen, and it's looks like it's kind of spreading across the tree. And this is a lichen in the genus Melanelixia. And we're actually going to see this on our walk on Foster floodplain. This is actually, you can see it in many places in Foster floodplain. So I wanted to go over this genus Melanelixia, and this grows on wood and is foliose. Let's go to the very last one. I wanted to save the most fun lichen for the last. This is of the genus Cladonia, and Cladonia are called Pixie lichens. And if you use your imagination a little bit, you will see that we have these stalks that almost look like goblets with a cup on the top, and they're the stalks that you see here are about 1.5 inches tall. And you can sort of imagine a tiny little winged pixie flying in and drinking from the cup. So that's one way to remember that these are called Pixie lichen. And Cladonia is a huge genus in terms of the number of species. So I'm not going to try to get into identifying it. There are some people who even specialize just in this one genus. And you can find it on both rock and wood. I actually found this 2 blocks from the Johnson Creek Watershed Council office here in the Woodstock neighborhood in Portland. You'll notice, I'll move my cursor here, you'll notice what look like little green leaves down in the lower right. And if you look carefully, you can see them scattered all over this picture. Those are part of the Cladonia lichen, as are these stalks with the cups on the top. So there's really a foliose and a fruticose piece to the Cladonia lichen. And that is really, really unusual. But what's interesting about this genus is, they're really not known either as foliose or fruticose. There's another term that's used, and that's squamulose. And that comes from a word meaning scaly. And it refers to those scales. The foliose part of it is really scaly. So this is referred to as squamulose, but it does have both that foliose and fruticose aspect to it. So finally, what I would like to do is just encourage those of you who are so inclined to take some photos that you find here in the Johnson Creek Watershed of different lichen and post it to iNaturalist. Of course, you'll need an account to be able to post, but iNaturalist, of course, is the largest worldwide general community science platform. Of course, I guess you could say eBird perhaps is the biggest worldwide. That's just for birds, but this is generally for anything biological. And you can post your photos, and who knows, somebody somewhere in the world may try to identify it for you. Although, once again, lichen are really hard to identify. So if you do post something, make sure your photos are really in focus. Maybe take them from both sides, because remember, the colors and features on different sides can be diagnostic. And then just in general, post to whatever level you're confident of, whether that be species, genus, or, with crustose lichens, sometimes only to the family level. And finally, here are two sources of information if you'd like to learn a little bit more about lichen in the Northwest, or macrolichen in particular. This book on the left, called Macrolichen of the Pacific Northwest, by two experts, McCune and Geyser. I highly recommend it. I have actually have a copy of that book right here, which you'll see. Oh, can you see it? Yeah, okay. Great book, has keys. It has all sorts of information about lichen, has some tables about air pollution sensitivity for each species. Of course, if you don't want to go out and buy a book, there's a fun website, not focused on the Northwest, but focused pretty much North America and Canada is the focus. And it has plenty of photos. It has some keys. And the website is waysoфenlightenment.net. That's one word, ways of enlightenment. So that is the end of the talk here, the webinar piece. What I'm going to do now is I have a microscope, a digital microscope, and let's take a look at some species under the microscope. So what I'm going to do, let's see, zoom here. I'm going to share screen. And I already have a lichen here under the scope. So let's take a look. What we're looking at here, as from the color, you probably guess. Let's see if I can focus it. Let's see, focus a little more. This is Sunburst lichen, and you can see the foliar look of the phallus, and you can also see at least in one case, a round apothecia sticking up from the phallus. So this is a tiny little twig that I have. You can see this is my fingernail tip for size comparison here. So this is really zoomed in. Now what's this next to the sunburst lichen? Well, this is really interesting. This is, let's move a little bit more. Any ideas out there? We're looking at oak moss. Very, very young oak moss. You can see it hasn't branched that much. And if we zoom, let's see, we can see some of the little soredia, the asexual reproductive elements. very tiny, powdery, dot looking. There's another type called Isidia, Isidia. They can be very difficult to tell apart, but if you look at them really zoomed in, the Isidia are more three-dimensional in shape. So let's take another look here. Here's another lichen. This is the shield. This is Parmelia sulcata. And notice it has, on the underside, it has those hairs, the rhizines I talked about, and you can see how the brown color on the bottom as opposed to the light green color on the top. And you can see, let's see if I can focus here, you can see down here in the bottom right corner, let's see if I can take a pen right in here, and you can see some of the soredia, clumps of them, those little spore-like structures, the soredia. And finally, just one little more we're going to take a look at. Just once again, we're going to look at the oak moss. And if you look right near, okay, there we go, right near the crosshairs in the lower left quadrant, right near the crosshairs, you can see some more of these little granular spore-like soredia. So that brings an end to our introduction to lichen, especially for those who are getting ready for going to our talk at Foster Floodplain. Thank you very much for joining us. Johnson Creek Watershed Council has a lot of events going on throughout the year. Please look at our website, www.jcwc.org. And there's a calendar. We have some more educational events coming up. But thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.